Water trickled gently over the smooth stones, creating a soft, rhythmic melody that had become my favorite sound over the years. The late afternoon sun cast golden reflections on the creek's surface as dragonflies hovered lazily above the water. Birds chirped from the nearby oak trees, their songs blending harmoniously with the murmur of the flowing stream. I sat on an old wooden bench near the creek's edge, my boots planted firmly in the cool, damp soil. This place, this little piece of untouched nature, was more than just a backyard feature to me. It was my sanctuary. After a long day of fixing pipes and dealing with stubborn plumbing issues, I'd come here, let my stress melt away, and listen to the water tell its ancient stories. "Mr. Jackson," a familiar voice called from across the yard. I looked up to see Timmy and Sarah Thompson, the neighborhood kids, sprinting toward me with wide grins on their faces. Timmy clutched a small plastic bucket, and Sarah had a net slung over her shoulder. "Can we look for tadpoles today?" Timmy asked, already hopping excitedly from rock to rock near the water's edge. "Sure thing," I chuckled. "Just remember, catch and release, okay?" The two kids nodded enthusiastically before crouching down to inspect the water. Sarah dipped her net in carefully, lifting it just enough to reveal a few tiny minnows darting between the mesh. "This creek is awesome," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's like a whole little world down here." I smiled, watching them. This creek had been here long before I moved in. It had shaped the land, nurtured the wildlife, and brought life to the community. The Thompsons weren't the only ones who enjoyed it. Families often stopped by, their kids eager to explore. But peace never lasts forever. As the kids laughed and played, I heard the mail truck pull up to my driveway. A thick envelope dropped into my mailbox with a heavy thud. I walked over, wiping my hands on my jeans, and pulled out the letter. The bold golden letters at the top made my stomach drop. Frowning, I tore it open and skimmed through the contents. My pulse quickened as my eyes locked onto one particular line. "Your property contains an unauthorized water feature that violates HOA safety regulations. Immediate removal is required." I read it again, my heart pounding. Unauthorized water feature? They were talking about my creek. A cold wave of disbelief washed over me as I continued reading. "Failure to comply within 30 days will result in escalating fines and legal action." I clenched my jaw. They were serious about this. "Mr. Jackson?" Timmy's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. I looked up to see both kids staring at me, concern etched on their young faces. "You okay?" Sarah asked. I forced a smile, folding the letter. "Yeah, I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. I turned back toward my creek, watching the water flow peacefully, as if unaware of the storm that was about to come crashing down. They can't do this, can they? The next morning, I was sipping my coffee on the porch when a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of my house. The tires crunched against the gravel as it came to a stop. The door swung open, and out stepped Karen Westfield, the self-proclaimed queen of the Maple Valley Homeowners Association. With her neatly pressed beige blazer, clipboard tucked under her arm, and an air of absolute authority, she looked around my property like she was already judging it. "Good morning, Mr. Jackson," she said, offering a tight, practiced smile. I set my coffee down and folded my arms. "Morning. Something I can help you with?" Karen wasted no time flipping through her clipboard. "I assume you received our letter regarding the unauthorized water feature on your property?" I sighed, already feeling the tension creep into my shoulders. "You mean my creek? The one that's been here for decades? Yeah, I got your letter." "Good," Karen said, as if this was a normal conversation and not a direct attack on my home. "Then you understand that according to the HOA's revised regulations, all water features must be approved and properly fenced to prevent potential safety hazards." I cut her off. "It's not a water feature. It's a natural creek. You can't just regulate a stream that's been flowing here long before you ever built houses around it." Karen let out a light chuckle, her manicured fingers tapping against her clipboard. "Mr. Jackson, we follow rules, not emotions. The HOA has determined that this body of water presents a liability risk. If children were to wander in and injure themselves, you could be held responsible. I clenched my jaw. The Thompson kids play here all the time, and their parents have never had a problem with it. No one has ever been hurt. Karen's smile didn't falter. Not yet, but it's our responsibility to prevent accidents before they happen. She took a step forward, her voice dropping slightly. You have 30 days to comply. That means either draining the creek or installing an HOA-approved fence around it. I felt my pulse spike. And if I refuse? Karen shrugged, flipping to another page. Then you'll be fined $500 for non-compliance, with an additional $100 daily penalty until the violation is corrected. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. This is ridiculous. Karen offered another fake smile. Those are the rules, Mr. Jackson. I'd advise you not to fight this. HOA violations can become quite expensive. She turned to leave, but not before giving my property one last disapproving glance. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. The very next morning, I was in my backyard when I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. I turned to see three men in matching HOA-branded polo shirts, clipboards, and cameras in hand. Without asking for permission, they walked straight onto my property like they owned the place. "Excuse me," I called out, stepping toward them. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Routine HOA inspection," the tallest man muttered, barely looking at me. One of them immediately started taking photos of the creek, crouching down at different angles, as if he was documenting a crime scene. Karen Westfield followed behind them, smug as ever. "Just making sure we have a complete record of your violation," she said sweetly. The second inspector made his way toward my vegetable garden, which I had spent years cultivating. He snapped a picture before scribbling something down. "What does my garden have to do with any of this?" I demanded. Karen glanced at my tomatoes and smirked. Section 8, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws states that vegetable gardens must be in backyard areas not visible from the street. Yours is visible from the side street. I clenched my fists. "It's in my backyard." "But it can be seen from the road," Karen countered. "That's a violation. Expect a notice for that as well." My blood was boiling now. "You're just looking for things to fine me for." Karen let out a mock gasp. "We're simply ensuring compliance." I watched helplessly as they continued their so-called inspection, taking notes, murmuring to each other, and clicking pictures as if they were collecting evidence for a trial. When they were finally done, Karen approached me one last time, holding out a bright yellow notice. "Consider this your official $500 violation ticket," she said, handing it to me. "Payment is due within 10 days. And remember, each additional day without compliance will add $100 to your balance." I stared at the paper in disbelief, my heart pounding. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. As Karen and her team walked away, I turned back toward my creek, my jaw tightening. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the HOA violation notice still crumpled in my fist. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why was the HOA so desperate to get rid of my creek? It wasn't harming anyone. It had been here for decades, long before any of these houses were even built. There had to be something more to this. I pulled out my property deed, old survey maps, and geological reports I had stored away when I first bought this house. I spread them across the table, my coffee growing cold as I studied every inch of the paperwork. And then, I found it. The creek wasn't just a natural water feature. It was a critical drainage system, part of the Riverstone Heights watershed, which helped regulate groundwater flow in the entire neighborhood. I compared an old geological survey from the 1960s to a newer property map. My heart pounded as I traced the origin of the creek. It flowed directly from the highest point in the area, right beneath Karen and Richard Westfield's house. "Son of a B asterisk 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 H," I muttered under my breath. I zoomed in on the map and noticed something even worse. HOA's newest development had been built on what used to be wetlands. They had paved over a natural water system and built expensive homes right on top of it. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The night was eerily quiet, only the sound of distant crickets filling the air. My boots crunched against the damp soil as I followed the creek upstream through the small wooded area separating my neighborhood from the newer development. The deeper I walked, the more uneasy I felt. Something wasn't right. Then I saw it, a large underground drainage pipe, partially hidden by cattails and debris. The pipe was feeding water straight into my creek. My mind raced. The HOA had diverted water from their development straight into my property. This wasn't about child safety or regulations. They were using my land as a dumping ground to cover up their own disastrous planning mistakes. I took out my phone and snapped as many photos and videos as I could. If I was going to fight back, I needed evidence. Then, just as I turned to leave, I heard something. A golf cart approaching. I ducked behind a tree as headlights cut through the darkness. A familiar figure stepped out, Richard Westfield. He was holding a large plastic container. I watched as he walked up to the retention pond and poured something into the water. Chemical runoff, pesticides, poison? Whatever it wasn't good. I waited until he drove off before creeping forward. Shining my flashlight over the pond's surface, I felt my stomach drop. Dead fish were already floating belly up. They weren't just diverting water, they were polluting it, and they were trying to erase the evidence before anyone found out. Breaking the news to my neighbors. By the time I got back home, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. The next morning, I walked over to Elaine Wong's house, one of the few neighbors who actually cared about what the HOA was doing. Elaine opened the door, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Jackson, it's 7 a.m. What's wrong?" "You need to see this," I said, handing her my phone. She scrolled through the photos, her face twisting in horror. "Oh my God, they knew." "They knew," I confirmed, "and they did it anyway." She exhaled sharply. "We need to tell the others." Within an hour, Elaine had gathered a small group in her backyard, the Thompsons, the Rodriguezes, and a few others who had also been victims of the HOA's ridiculous policies. I laid out the maps, showed them the photos, and explained everything. "This creek wasn't a problem until now," I said. "Why?" "Because the HOA built their million-dollar homes on a swamp, and now that the water is rising, they're trying to use my land to drain it. They don't care about safety. They care about covering their own asses." A silence fell over the group. Then, Sarah Thompson spoke up. "If they get away with this, what's stopping them from coming for the rest of us?" A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Elaine clenched her jaw. "So, what do we do?" I looked back at my creek, the water still flowing, unaware of the battle that was about to unfold. We fight back." The sound of heavy machinery woke me up the next morning. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then the deep, mechanical roar of excavators and the sharp clang of metal against stone jolted me upright. I threw on a jacket and stormed outside. What I saw made my blood boil. 2 large HOA-hired construction vehicles were already tearing into the creek, their massive claws ripping into the earth like vultures. Workers in neon vests stomped around, setting up barriers and laying down drainage pipes to redirect the water. And standing in the middle of it all, smug as ever, was Karen Westfield. She turned when she saw me, flashing the fake, tight-lipped smile. "Good morning, Mr. Jackson." "Just ensuring compliance." "Are you serious?" I snapped, my voice barely masking the fury bubbling inside me. "You're actually doing this?" Karen adjusted her designer watch, looking bored. "The creek is in violation of HOA policy, and you refuse to take action. We're simply doing what needs to be done." I turned to the workers. "Hey, stop! This is my land!" One of the foremen, a burly guy with a clipboard, glanced at me and shrugged. "HOA hired us, said they had authority over all drainage systems in the neighborhood." I clenched my fists. "This isn't just drainage. You're destroying an ecosystem." Karen let out a short laugh. "Spare me the dramatics, Mr. Jackson. It's just water." I watched, helpless, as the creek, the heart of my home, my sanctuary, was reduced to nothing. By noon, the water was completely gone. Where there had once been glistening ripples, darting minnows, and singing frogs, Now there was only dry, cracked earth and exposed rocks. My creek was dead. And there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it. The skies had been gray all day, but I barely noticed. My mind was clouded with rage, frustration, and helplessness. But as the sun set, the air grew thick and heavy. A distant rumble of thunder sent vibrations through the ground. Oh, a storm was coming. And I sat on my porch, staring at the empty creek bed. My fists clenched so tightly my knuckles turned white. Oh! Then the rain started. Slow at first, then harder. The downpour grew into a relentless torrent, hammering against rooftops, streets, and sidewalks. I watched as rainwater pooled in the gutters, spilling over onto lawns. But something felt wrong. The water wasn't draining properly, and then it hit me. The HOA had cut off a natural drainage system. The water was supposed to flow through the creek, but with the creek destroyed, it had nowhere to go. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the storm, the rain soaking through my clothes instantly. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a few puddles near the sidewalks. Nothing alarming. But as I walked deeper into the HOA's pristine neighborhood, the situation got worse. Water was seeping up from the ground, bubbling through cracks in the pavement. I took another step forward, and my boots sank into the grass. The ground beneath me was soft, unstable, shifting. Then I heard yelling, panicked voices, flashlights flickering in the storm. I ran toward the commotion and found Richard Westfield, standing in his driveway, a frantic look on his face. "What's going on?" I called out, barely able to hear over the rain. He spun around, his expensive raincoat already soaked through. "The storm drains are backing up," he shouted. "Basements are flooding." I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction in my chest, but I kept my face neutral. "Oh, that's weird," I said. "I wonder where all the water is supposed to go." Richard's face paled as the realization hit him. Then, behind him, I saw something even worse. Karen Westfield's perfectly manicured front yard was now a shallow pond. But it wasn't just her lawn. Water was pushing up through the foundation of their house. The ground was sinking. Their million-dollar home, the one they had built over a natural wetland, was collapsing. By midnight, the entire HOA neighborhood was in chaos. Families were scrambling to move their belongings as water poured into their basements. Sewage lines had backed up. Electrical panels were short-circuiting. Roads were collapsing. I watched from a distance, flashlight in hand, as HOA board members ran around like headless chickens, screaming into their phones, demanding emergency city assistance. Karen was in the middle of it all, her pristine reputation drowning alongside her sinking house. And all I could think was, water always finds a way. I stood at the edge of the destruction, watching the neighborhood descend into madness. Elaine found me panting, her raincoat dripping. "Jackson, are you seeing this?" I smirked, wiping rain from my face. "Oh yeah." She shook her head, staring at the sinking houses. "They did this to themselves." I nodded. "They wanted to control nature, but you can't just erase something that's been here for centuries." Lightning flashed, illuminating Karen standing in the middle of her flooded yard, her hair and clothes completely drenched, watching her empire crumble before her eyes. And for the first time since this fight started, she looked truly terrified. I turned back toward my land, toward the empty creek bed. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over yet. The next morning, a mandatory emergency HOA meeting was announced. The email was stamped with "urgent" in bold red letters. "Emergency HOA meeting, attendance required. Failure to attend will result in automatic approval of emergency measures." They were desperate. I arrived at the community center just before 7 p.m. The parking lot was overflowing. Neighbors whispered anxiously amongst themselves, their faces filled with worry, frustration, and, most of all, rage. Inside, the room was packed. People who never cared about HOA meetings before were here now. Why? Because they had thousands of dollars in water damage and they wanted answers. At the front of the room sat Karen and Richard Westfield, along with the other HOA board members. Karen's hair was neatly styled, but she couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes. Richard, sitting beside her, was furiously typing on his laptop. They looked exhausted. They looked defeated. And I was about to bury them. Karen cleared her throat and tapped the microphone. "Everyone, please settle down." The chatter died down, but the tension in the room was thick as fog. As you all know, our community has experienced a rather unfortunate flooding event. Unfortunate, a man in the crowd scoffed. "Karen, my basement looks like a damn swimming pool." Scattered murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. Richard leaned forward. "We understand your frustrations. This appears to be a city drainage issue, and rest assured, we are demanding immediate action from local authorities." I let out a sharp laugh from the back. "Oh, so now it's the city's fault." All eyes turned toward me. This was my moment. I stood up holding a thick folder of documents. "Before you try and shift the blame, let's talk about what actually happened." Karen stiffened. "Mr. Jackson, this is an HOA meeting. If you have complaints, please submit them in writing." "Oh, I have more than complaints. I have proof." I walked up to the front, slapping my documents onto the podium. I turned on the projector, displaying the property maps and geological surveys I had gathered. Photo hash 1. The original 1960s topographical map of the neighborhood, showing that the HOA was built on natural wetlands. Photo hash 2. The illegal drainage pipe feeding water into my now-destroyed creek. Photo hash 3. A snapshot of Richard Westfield dumping chemicals into the retention pond. This isn't a city issue. This is an HOA issue. This creek wasn't just decoration. It was a critical drainage system. And you knew it. The room went dead silent. I scanned the audience. People were frozen, staring at the evidence. Some turned toward Karen and Richard with wide, furious eyes. Karen shifted uncomfortably, but Richard leaned in, trying to maintain control. "These are baseless accusations." "Baseless," I scoffed. "I have an environmental report from a geologist that says otherwise." I held up the official letter from Dr. Martinez, the environmental scientist I had consulted. "According to this report, the HOA's actions directly caused the flooding. You ignored warnings. You built over a watershed. You funneled excess water into private properties. And when it became a problem, you destroyed the last natural drainage system in the area." The crowd erupted. "Is this true? Karen, did you know about this? This is fraud." Karen's face turned bright red. "This meeting is over," she snapped. "Oh no, Karen," I said, stepping closer. "It's just getting started." I pulled up one last document on the projector. A letter from the insurance company. "Oh, and one more thing. If any of you were hoping insurance would cover the damages, you might want to sit down." Key section of the letter. "Due to evidence of human-caused drainage manipulation by the Maple Valley HOA, flood damage claims will not be covered. Homeowners will be responsible for all repair costs." The room exploded. "What? You mean we have to pay for this ourselves? Are you kidding me?" Karen stood up abruptly. "We are in talks with the insurance company." "Oh, shut up, Karen," a man in the front row snapped. "You lied to us." The vote that ended it all. The entire room turned against the HOA. Neighbors were yelling, demanding resignations, calling for lawsuits. Elaine stood up and raised her voice. "I propose an immediate vote to remove the HOA board and hold new elections." "Second," someone else shouted. Karen and Richard's faces went pale. "You can't just," Richard started. "Actually," I interrupted, "per HOA bylaws, if 75% of homeowners vote to remove leadership, it's legally binding." "Let's vote." Hands shot up across the entire room. "All to a board removed effective immediately." New election scheduled. HOA policies under review. Karen and Richard, finished. As I walked out of the meeting, Elaine caught up with me. "Oh, Jackson, you just destroyed them." I smiled. They did that to themselves. As I stepped into the night, I glanced back toward the ruined neighborhood. Justice had been served. The night after the emergency HOA meeting, I stood outside on my porch, staring at the dark clouds rolling in. Another storm was coming. But this time, I wasn't worried. I took a deep breath, letting the damp air fill my lungs. The battle was almost over. Karen and Richard had lost the HOA, their reputation, and their control. Now nature was coming to finish the job. By midnight, the rain had turned into a full-blown storm. The wind howled through the trees and water poured down in thick sheets, flooding the streets. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. I needed to see this with my own eyes. The HOA neighborhood was already in bad shape from the last flood. But this storm was the final nail in the coffin. I walked toward Karen and Richard's house, my boots splashing through the rising water. And that's when I saw it. Their once luxurious mansion, the one they had built on top of an unstable wetland, was sinking. Cracks had already started forming along the foundation, but now, large sections of the yard were breaking apart. The lawn was no longer solid ground. It was a soft, sinking swamp. Through the storm, I saw Karen standing on her front porch, screaming into her phone, "Someone fix this! Our house is falling apart!" But it was too late. A loud crack echoed through the night. One of the support beams snapped, and a portion of the house tilted forward, as if being swallowed whole. Richard came running out, his expensive shoes sloshing through ankle-deep water. His eyes darted around, looking for someone, anyone, to blame. "This is your fault," he screamed at me. I smirked. "No, Richard, this is your fault. You built a house on a swamp. What did you think was going to happen?" Another deep rumble shook the ground. Then it happened. The entire left side of their house collapsed inward, crashing into the muddy ground below. A gaping hole formed where their dining room used to be. Karen let out a horrified shriek. Richard could only stare in shock. The HOA's king and queen had just lost their castle. By morning, the storm had passed, but the damage was done. Word spread fast about what happened to Karen and Richard's house. Neighbors gathered in the streets, shaking their heads in disbelief. Serves them right. They destroyed our homes, and now theirs is gone. This HOA has done nothing but ruin our lives. And then the final blow came. Elaine, standing on the community center steps, raised her voice. "We started the process last night. We have the votes. It's time to disband the HOA for good." A roar of approval erupted from the crowd. Effective immediately, the HOA was officially dismantled. All remaining fines and violations were nullified. Karen and Richard? Stripped of all power. For the first time in years, people felt free. With the HOA gone, I wasted no time. I rallied the neighbors, gathered volunteers, and started working on restoring the creek. Dirt was removed, native plants were replanted, water started flowing again. It wasn't just about fixing the land, it was about healing the community. As I stood by the creek, watching the water ripple over the rocks once more, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Elaine joined me, smiling. "You did it, Jackson. We all did." I nodded. "Yeah, and now we make sure no one ever tries to destroy it again." A few days later, a moving truck pulled up in front of Karen and Richard's half-destroyed home. Neighbors watched in silence as they packed up what was left of their belongings. Karen, once so proud and arrogant, now looked defeated. Richard shot me a venomous glare as he climbed into his car. "You ruined us." I took a step forward, staring him down. "No, Richard, you did that yourself." Without another word, they sped off, leaving the neighborhood forever. As I stood by my fully restored creek, I watched as a blue heron landed at the water's edge, dipping its beak in and taking a drink. The birds were back. The frogs were back. Nature had reclaimed what was hers. Elaine chuckled beside me. "You know, I found something funny in Karen's old garage before they left." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? What was it?" She held up a rusty HOA sign that read, "Danger, water hazard, keep children away." She flipped it over. On the back, in faded letters, was another sign, one that had been long forgotten. Protected wetlands do not disturb. I laughed. Guess they should have listened. Elaine grinned. Nature always wins. And as I watched the water flow freely once more, I knew she was right. The soft gurgle of flowing water filled the air as the creek ran freely once again, winding through the land like it always had. Sunlight danced across the ripples, reflecting off smooth stones as minnows darted beneath the surface. I stood at the edge, letting the cool mist brush against my skin. The place that once felt like a battlefield was finally at peace. Behind me, laughter echoed through the trees. Mr. Jackson, look at this one. I turned to see Timmy and Sarah Thompson, knee-deep in the water, cupping their hands together to show me a tiny frog. I smiled. That's a good one, Timmy. Make sure you put him back where you found him. Sarah grinned. We will. The creek is so much better now. I watched as they splashed through the water, their excitement a reminder of what had been nearly lost. For weeks, the neighborhood had come together, working day and night to restore what the HOA had tried to erase. Now the birds had returned, the frogs had come back, and the land had healed. I sat down on my old wooden bench, letting out a deep sigh. For the first time in months, I felt free. I had spent so much time fighting, resisting, standing my ground, and now, sitting here, I finally understood something. Nature is not the enemy. People who try to control it are. Karen and Richard had thought they could rewrite the rules of the earth, that they could erase a creek, pave over a wetland, and outsmart the forces of nature. But nature doesn't follow HOA bylaws. It flows, it adapts, it wins. And if you try to control it, it will always fight back. As I sat there, I glanced toward the far end of the neighborhood. And there it was. Karen and Richard's half-sunken, abandoned house. The once pristine mansion was now a wreck, its walls cracked, its foundation ruined, and its windows covered in grime. A for sale sign stood in the yard, leaning slightly in the damp earth, but no one wanted to buy a house built on a swamp. It was poetic. The people who had once ruled this neighborhood, controlled everyone, and tried to erase nature were gone. And their empire? It had drowned in the very water they tried to bury. I leaned back on my bench, closing my eyes for a moment. The HOA was gone. The creek was alive again. And the neighborhood was finally free. Elaine walked over, handing me a cold lemonade. You know, she said, staring at the abandoned house, I almost feel bad for them. I took a sip. Almost, she chuckled. I guess some people never learn. I smirked, watching as a heron landed by the water's edge, dipping its beak into the stream. No, I said, but nature always teaches them. The wind rustled through the trees. The creek kept flowing. And for the first time in a long time, everything was exactly as it was meant to be. The end.